Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. Thanks for joining in this instance of the Antrea community meeting. Today is Tuesday, February 28th, or of course, still Monday if you are in the United States. And for today, we have two topics on the agenda. The first is will be discussed by Antonin and is about revisiting the Antrea user interface to move away from the Octant plugin and develop a new React web user interface. The second topic will be discussed by Pulkit and is about setting up a continuous CI pipeline, for Antrea Rancher integration. So since today we have a fairly packed meeting, I will probably defer to Antonin to start with the first topic for today in today's agenda.
Hi, thanks, Salvatore. Hi, everyone. So I don't have slides, but I will just give a quick walkthrough of my proposal, for which I have opened the GitHub issue, and then I will do a demo of the prototype I've built. So let me share my screen. All right, hopefully you guys can see my my browser right now and the GitHub issue I have opened for this. So as you guys may be familiar with, or probably familiar with, early on in the life of the Antrea project, we decided to develop an Octant plugin. So Octant is some sort of or rather was some sort of a dashboard for Kubernetes, giving you access to your Kubernetes resources, so you can quickly check the resources you have, access things like the logs of your different pods, for example, look at your CRDs and so on. And when we developed the Antrea Octant plugin, the first functionality we added, and actually pretty much the major functionality we added was the ability to run trace flows from the Octant web UI and visualize the results as a graph within the Octant UI. However, and it's been like this for a couple months, Octant is now deprecated and will no longer be maintained. I think actually the last commit is more than 1 year old. I think Chen pointed that out in the previous meeting. And in addition to Octant no longer being maintained, I think I want to point out that keeping the Octant plugin running in the last couple of years has not been like super easy, because the Octant API, which is used as a communication channel between Octant and the Octant plugin, has been changing. It's been hard for users to figure out which version of Octant they should use with each version of Antrea, and so on. And I detailed a few of those issues in the GitHub issue here. And in addition to that, I think it's not super clear like what kind of value we provide with the Octant UI. Of course, people can run traceflow, but it's also possible to run traceflow from the CLI, for example. And I don't think just the ability to run traceflow like makes it really interesting to deploy Octant with the Antrea Octant plugin. So yes, that's about it for the background on Antrea Octant and the Antrea Octant plugin. So what I propose in this issue is, of course, to remove support for our Octant plugin, even delete it potentially from the code base in a couple of releases, and replace it with a custom web UI, which at first would have the same functionality as our Octant plugin, but which would have like a large potential for growth. For example, if we want to be able to add some visibility features to the UI. And for the sake of this presentation, I've built a prototype of a UI using the React web framework and the Clarity design system, which is also a design system for web applications that was open sourced by VMware, but it's been around for a long time. And so I think I'm gonna jump right away into the demo, and then I can come back on the architecture and talk about like possible improvements and kind of like the proposed architecture. So a little bit of background on my setup here. I have had it running for a while, but basically I just have one Kubernetes cluster running on my laptop. I've deployed a couple of pods for the sake of being able to run TraceFlow. Of course, the cluster is running Antrea. And on top of that, I have a web server running in this tab, which is serving my React application. And here I have an API server, which is gonna, well, serve the APIs which are invoked from the React application to access information about Antrea and to run TraceFlow. And so let me go back to my browser. I'm gonna open, so for the sake of this, the UI is running locally. So I'm gonna open the UI here, log in quickly. Here we go. So on this tab is kind of like what I call the summary tab. And what it does is it's very simple right now. It's just fetching the information which we publish in the agent info CRD and controller info CRD, and it's displaying some of that information here. So this is mostly a placeholder. I'm only showing a very small subset of this information here. Of course, we could add more information to this page. The second tab I built here is, well, where I've spent the most time really. It's the TraceFlow implementation. I'm not sure it's totally feature complete compared to what we have in the Octane plugin today. For example, I don't think I haven't implemented live traffic TraceFlow, but I'm just gonna run a quick TraceFlow by copying the names of the pods. So I'm gonna take this one and that one. Leave everything default, run TraceFlow. So it's going to can take a few seconds. And then here we go. It's going to display a graph. Didn't spend too much time on the formatting. It would be possible, of course, to have that graph to reorganize that graph. I think in the current Octane plugin, we have nodes with an horizontal layout and not a vertical layout like this. But yeah, so basically this is how you run TraceFlow. It's very easy to run the same TraceFlow again. You just click the button again. It's going to run it. And well, we don't see any change, but because the same graph is generated. Actually, can I take another? Let me take another pod, maybe the core DNS one here. Yeah, and oh, well, it didn't work. I guess I'll look into it later.
And the namespace doesn't match. Yeah,
oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I haven't added error reporting in the UI yet, so I guess it should be in the console maybe. But yeah, I'm displaying the old trace for you. I guess there is probably an error somewhere. Thanks, Jen. And if I run it, here we go. So it's on the same node this time. And yeah, there is a reset button to just go back to all defaults. And the next tab, so this one I haven't implemented. But sorry, I have implemented some UI parts, obviously, but I haven't implemented any backend part. So this is kind of like a very small example of what we could do if we wanted to display some flow visibility information into the UI. And I just did this using like fake data from a JSON file that I created with a script. I just wanted to show what could be done with kind of like the graph libraries that we can, the JavaScript graph libraries that we could use. So it just displays kind of like here in the tab, the latest flows, and in the graph, the rates of new connections per minute. So with that sample data, we're always at about like 15 to 20 new flows per minute in the cluster. I put like a sample network policy tab here, but there is there's nothing yet, but we could imagine being able to run network policy recommendation from here and have the API server for this web application talk to the SIA manager to manage network policy recommendation, and then have a download option to download the YAML recommendations, for example. So that's about it for the prototype, the UI prototype I've built for this. I think I can maybe take a quick break here and see if there are any questions.
A very stupid question on my end. I'm more about a development effort. So in your opinion, I know nothing about UI, but in your opinion, how challenging is it more difficult to develop for this new UI rather than keeping maintaining the Octant plugin? Besides the fact that Octant is deprecated, do you think that it will need the dev team to gather more skills? There will be more dependencies to manage, or is pretty much straightforward?
Well, I don't think it's very difficult. Obviously, there is a bit of effort to get started, but if you look at the Octant plugin we have, there was also kind of like some effort initially for the people working on this, because it's using kind of like the internal Octant API to do things like if you think about the Traceflow plugins we have, which has like a form with fields like this. Well, instead of dealing with like HTML form fields, you're dealing with like the Octant API to create the form. So obviously there is a bit of effort to get familiar with the framework, but I think the idea is to have something that we can keep building incrementally, and that obviously doesn't rely on a project that's deprecated. You can imagine that at some point Octant is going to stop working with future version of Kubernetes, for example.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Antonin, I do have one question also, which is, has the idea come up of, instead of building a separate UI, I'm just wondering, a lot of other plugins that existed for Octant moved to writing plugins for Lens, for example, which has kind of become the standard replacement for Octant. Wondering if that came up.
I'll take a look. I confess I haven't thought about it, but I can take the action item to look into it.
All right. Yeah, I know that like Starboard did that. There's a few projects that did, and they actually have a more stable API for plugins. So not that I necessarily think it's a better idea, but maybe worth looking into.
Yeah, I'll take a look. I'm a bit worried about the whole plugin model because you always tend to run into an obstacle at some point, and you're trying to do something and you just cannot do it with that, or it's not easy to do with the plugin framework. But I'll definitely take a look.
You also depend on the client, the user having another tool instead of just being dependent on your UI.
Exactly. Yeah. So it typically doesn't work out of the box, right? And it's great if the user is already using a Lens for other things. In this case, they can have everything in one place. But yeah, it was a case also here where we were asking users to deploy Octant, possibly just to be able to run trace flows for Antrea, for example.
Definitely. You also showed authentication in the UI. What is that authentication? Is that a separate authentication from the cluster auth?
It is a separate authentication. I just built something very basic here where it's using password based, and then it's retrieving a JWT token, which is going to be used in the API calls. I haven't kind of like made up my mind of about what the authentication schemes could be. I think a lot of when I started looking at building the UI, I kind of look at what Cilium had done with Hubble, and I was kind of surprised that there was no authentication mechanism built in for Hubble, because it seemed to me that if you expose the UIs, then people can collect information about like the flows in your network, for example, pretty easily. And so I wanted us to think about how we could like build in some authentication layer to make it a bit more secure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Otherwise, of course, I mean, you can always be careful and configure like network policies to prevent access to your UI service. But yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to have some basic authentication. I know that even Grafana in the free version, when you deploy it, you have some basic authentication mechanism, which is password based as well.
Awesome.
Hi, Anthony. There is an authentication in the UI system itself, but how the UI system talks to the Kubernetes API, it will use some configured kubeconfig or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you need to. So I was gonna cover that, but it depends on how we decide to run the UI, right? For example, if it runs, it could run as a container in the Antrea controller pod. And in this case, it may be not the most secure solution. It would inherit the RBAC configuration from the controller. Or if we run it as a pod, then we need to, as a separate pod and a separate deployment, then we need to configure the service account to have the necessary permissions to do things like create trace flows and access the agent info and controller info CRs and so on.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Right now, I just passed the API server an admin kube. If I can show you, if I can scroll up. Yeah, when I started it, I passed it my admin kube config, so it has the permissions to access the API, the Kubernetes APIs. But in a pod, of course, we would use the proper RBAC configuration.
Got it.
Could it also be a feature like in and-cuddle is the CLI of just doing like and-cuddle UI that would connect to my local kube config, and then you don't have any server-side component? And then it would use the local kube config by default? That could then be within a container, technically, if someone wanted to run it server-side.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. What if the server was implemented actually like almost through like and-cuddle --UI as a CLI plugin instead of as a container? Instead of as a pod, if it was a client-side UI, and then it would use the local kube config of that user in order to visualize.
So the way I see it, if you run ntl UI, rather than do what you're describing, it would just like configure a local port and configure port forwarding so that it can connect automatically to the web server pod. If you do what you're describing, I think, I mean, you need the ability to run some maybe would have to think about how to package it so you can run it locally easily on your laptop. I guess it is possible.
Yeah, because the one benefit there is that, and that at least then you're using whatever the user's kube config is, whatever he has access to. Right? Or if you did something similar to what Kube apps did with authentication, where they'd use OAuth2 proxy to the Kubernetes cluster, and the login is actually the tokens used against Kubernetes.
The thing is, when you do that, you're kind of restricting yourself in terms of what kind of APIs you can invoke.
Right.
Because it basically you're only talking to the Kubernetes API server. So obviously you have access to the Kubernetes APIs, you have access to CRDs, you have access to aggregated APIs. But for example, in visibility, having access to the SIA manager APIs would be more complicated than if the web server was running as a pod, if the UI was running as a pod, right?
Right.
Because now you have to expose those services additionally.
Yeah.
So it does work well as long as you just need to access the Kubernetes API.
Makes sense.
Tony, you're not just talking about Octant plugin, right? But you also talk about replacing Grafana with new UI. Is that what you're thinking about?
Well, I didn't say that explicitly, but that's kind of my ideal goal. Yes. I think I'd like to see if we can like build visibility features inside that UI so that we have like a single UI and once again, and it's related to Scott's earlier comment about like lens, so that we don't require users to deploy an additional service like Grafana if they don't need to or don't want to.
Yeah, I think for our Octant UI, it's kind of simple. I think it's easy for me to understand. But for Grafana, do you also have a evaluation that how many efforts needed to rebuild all the features we have and the potentially new features?
Well, it's going to be some work, but that's kind of why I built that sample UI page. It's pretty primitive, of course, but I think from the point of view of just being able to draw graph, it's not very difficult. And I think implementing an API for the backend that's kind of like similar to what Grafana is doing, but just for our use case, I don't think it would be very complicated either. And the advantage would be that we could easily support both like our ClickHouse implementation and our Snowflake implementation in TIA with the same API.
Okay.
Okay, so finally, from let's say more the organizational side, I believe that this new UI, instead of leaving in the Antrea repo, will have its own standalone repository, right? That will make more sense.
Either way is okay. Right now, I've developed it assuming that it would probably be a separate repository, at least at first. And so, I mean, one implication of that is to keep things simple. When I invoke like Kubernetes APIs, I use a dynamic client, so I don't need to have access to the Antrea API types for TraceFlow, for example. But it can also be part of the same repository. I think it's just up to us. It seems to me that a common approach is to start with like a separate repository and then potentially transition to a unique repository at the end. It is a bit tedious to have many repositories after some time, right? Because when we update like things like tooling, for example, the Go version or GitHub Actions or things like this, we kind of have to go back and do it in every repository, which can be a bit tedious. But I guess one more repository is not going to make a big difference.
Sounds good.
So in terms of architecture, I think it has mostly come up in the previous discussions and comments from Scott and Chan. But yeah, the idea is basically that if you, with a simple, just a couple commands, we would be able to give the user access to the UI. It would mostly rely on kubectl port forward to expose the Antrea UI service locally, and then the user would just be able to connect to that port in their local browser. The Antrea UI is essentially just a web server, which is serving both the React application at the base path and is serving some APIs at /API, and those APIs are invoked by the React application. And inside the API implementation, we can access pretty much anything we want since we're running inside the cluster. So with the right RBAC, we can access the Kubernetes API server, and we should also be able to access a CI manager for visibility, potentially Flow Aggregator directly. I wasn't sure what was the best option there. And yes, that's about it for the presentation. So I was intending to keep working on this a bit and then submit it upstream for review. Obviously, if you have any feedback after the meeting, please feel free to leave a comment in the issue.
Sounds good. So do we have any more questions for Antonin today? Any observation on the UI? Any idea? Please go ahead. I'm waiting a few more seconds in case somebody's thinking about a question. But it appears it might be all for today on the UI. So I think that's definitely an interesting development. I like the idea of, personally, I like the idea of bringing together the TIA and Antrea UI. I think it's also better for users, right? They don't want to have two UIs. We have probably to work a little bit to figure out how, if and how we can reuse all the work that's been invested in Grafana, but there will be time for thinking about it. And so now the next topic in today's agenda, as mentioned during the introduction to the meeting, is the CI pipeline for Rancher integration. So that will go a nice addition in terms of supported Kubernetes distributions for Antrea. And I think that Pulkit will give us a presentation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Salvatore. Hello, everyone. I'll share the screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yep, it is.
So hello, everyone. Today I'll discuss on the Rancher CI pipeline for the upstream Antrea. The agenda for today's presentation is the design of the CI pipeline, the implementation, the technical issues that we have faced, the future development plan for the CI pipeline, demo, and then we will have the question and answer round for it. So moving forward with the design for the Rancher CI pipeline. So it follows the usual design pattern that we have that we follow for our CI pipeline. So we have a GitHub trigger phase which passes on to the SME service, which triggers the job on the public Jenkins. So for Rancher, the different thing that we have is we have a Rancher server and we have Rancher agent. These two are the main things for the Rancher. Well, the Rancher server deploys the UI console, that is the dashboard, from where we perform the manual CRUD operations to create the Rancher cluster. And then on this Rancher cluster, we run the test. So Rancher cluster is connected to our Rancher agent with the help of the access token and the cluster context. So these are the two things with the help of which we connect our Rancher agent node to the Rancher clusters on which we are running the test. And Rancher agent is also connected to the Rancher server. So with the help of the API, and this agent node is registered as a Jenkins node, which perform the test on the Jenkins. Like whenever we trigger any job, so what happens is on this node, and the job on this node, we perform the operations like the kubectl and the Rancher commands we run on this node, and this node in further runs the test on this cluster. So the Kubernetes is deployed on this cluster, and we have the Rancher CLI and the Rancher commands to be run on this node. This is the Rancher agent node. And this UI dashboard, this is important because currently we are creating the clusters manually. So we are creating and deletion, both these operations, creation, deletion, updation, and even fetching the data is with the is the manual operation from the UI. Though we can have few CLI commands to fetch the kubeconfig files and to get the list of the nodes, the pods running with from the Rancher cluster with the help of this Rancher CLI commands. So this is a design for this Rancher CI pipeline. And then moving forward, with the implementation. So implementation has two steps. One was the setting up of the Rancher server, and the another one was the setting up of the Rancher CLI or the Rancher agent, because these two are the most important part of the Rancher CI pipeline. So setting up of the Rancher server was basically running the Rancher server container from the server node, and then we had a UI dashboard deployed with like whenever we run the Rancher server container, then on the same IP with the ports that we have specified, we have a UI dashboard deployed, and from that UI dashboard we can create the clusters. So to create the clusters, we can specify the node templates and whatever specifications we want, and on that itself we can specify Antrea as the network plugin there. So that I'll also show in the demo when I'll give the demo that how Antrea is applied when creating the Rancher cluster through the UI. And then once the server is deployed, then we can have an agent testbed setup where we can connect the Rancher agent to the Rancher server with the help of the API tokens using the Rancher CLI commands. And then once this setup is done, then we can connect the Rancher CLI to a particular cluster. Like firstly, we need to connect it to the server, and then we need to connect it to the cluster with the help of the cluster context, so that we can fetch the clusters kube config, the nodes that are running, and the pods that are there on that clusters. And then this agent node is registered as a test bed on the Jenkins, so that we can run E2E conformance and network policy tests. So this is a basic implementation of the CI pipeline. Moving forward with the technical issues that we have faced, during this CI pipeline setup. So the first one was the dynamic cluster creation. So this is still now not fixed. So we have also raised an issue with the Rancher community, because there was an issue when we created this vSphere clusters with the help of the Rancher CLI command and deployed Antrea as a network plugin there. So it was not taking vSphere as the infrastructure provider, and neither it was applying Antrea. Rather, it was taking a custom infrastructure provider, and the Antrea plugin was also not working with the dynamic cluster creation. So this is one of the technical issue that we are facing. And the second one was the taints and tolerations of the Rancher node. So the taints and tolerations, the error that was here was like, in general, our E2E code is familiar with the control hyphen plane. That is an issue with the that is a label that we provide to the control plane node. But in this Rancher, it's a property that the label of the control plane node is control plane comma etcd, and then there are few additional taints, because of which the pods, when running the end-to-end test, they were not being assigned or not being scheduled to any of the nodes because of the taints that were there. So this was fixed. We removed certain taints, and in certain part we modified the E2E code where it was flexible, and then we had the test running successfully. Second one was the issue in fetching the cluster siders and the service siders. So generally what we had was the cube controller manager it runs as a pod in a general Kubernetes cluster, but in a Rancher cluster we do not have this cube controller manager running as a pod. So the way we need to fetch the cluster siders and service siders was different, as it was already present in the Antrea E2E code. So we needed to modify it, because in Rancher we need to run this command from the control plane node, and then from there we can fetch from the control plane node logs. From there we have this cluster siders and the service siders there, instead of kube controller manager pod logs. And then the third issue was the configuring properties of the cluster. So there were few properties like this service cluster IP range itself. So the service cluster IP range, generally we can provide it in the YAML file and we can apply that, but in this case of the Rancher cluster, that cannot be done. And we need to have a particular template and few of the properties that needed to be set up to have this service cluster IP range and the cluster siders in place. And they have to be applied also in a different manner from the Rancher agent, so that they are in the working state. So these were few of the technical issues that we faced. So few of them were fixed, and dynamic cluster creation is still in place, and the issue is there with the Rancher community. We haven't heard back from them. Then moving forward with the future development plan for this. So currently, since we are doing everything manually, we are creating the cluster manually and we are deleting the clusters also manually. So in future, we plan to have this creation of the cluster manually in the runtime, so that we can have multiple jobs triggered at the same time. Currently, if we want to trigger multiple jobs, then we need to create the multiple clusters manually from the Rancher UI dashboard. So once we have this issue set up and we have a workaround on this, then we can proceed with the dynamic cluster creation, so that we can create the clusters in the at the time of run of the job, so that we do not need to go to the UI dashboard every time and create the cluster there and then delete it from there after the tests are completed. So this is what our future development plan is. So I'll take a break here. So if anyone has any questions on the design, implementation, or the any other technical questions, then we can have those, or else we'll move forward with the demo.
It's like you can go ahead, Pulkit.
Okay, I'll go forward with the demo. Second. Take a screen share again. So this is the Rancher UI. I hope you all are able to see the Rancher UI dashboard. So these are the clusters which are there. And then so that we can directly create a cluster here using the VMware vSphere. So as I mentioned in one of the technical issues, so if we created the cluster with the help of the CLI command, then the provider here was coming out to be a custom provider instead of the VMware vSphere provider. So here we have these providers. This is the cluster we are using for the test purpose. So we have all these controller nodes and the worker nodes running here. We can also check the status of the pods that are there on the particular node. So we have these are the pods that are running on this node, and similarly we can check for the other node, and then we can run the kubectl shell directly here. So these are the labels that are there. So as I mentioned that there is a control plane and the etcd, so similar was there in the taints also. So that has been removed for the E2E test purpose. And then we have this, we have to create this node templates. So whenever creating a cluster, we need to have a node template. So this one is for the controller node template, and these are the worker node templates. So if we want to have a look at it, so here we specify this thing. So in this labels, we can specify the control hyphen plane, which is our label for the same. And then so that we can have this also as one of the taints here, which is generally with the other Kubernetes clusters. So as to make it work similar to that. So this is how the node templates are, and then we can have the node templates for the worker nodes also, where we'll not have this taints and everything. So whenever we can want to create a cluster, we can directly click on create. We can select our provider, and then we can name the cluster. We can choose the template. Like for the control plane node, we can choose the control plane template. We can select that it should be an etcd and a control plane one. And then similarly, we can have a worker node. It is must to have an etcd node here, but otherwise the cluster will not be created, and the cluster agent will also not get connected. But if we do not have all these type of nodes specified here. So this is the Rancher UI. And then we have this Rancher cluster also. So I'll share this one. Yeah. So this is the Rancher CLI command that was set up here. So if we want to get the nodes, then we can directly do this. Run this command. So it will list us the nodes that are there. This is the controller node. Then we have two worker nodes that are running here. And then if we want to list the clusters that are there, so this is the Rancher CI one, then test, and this is the local cluster that is created whenever we deploy a dashboard, deploy the Rancher server. Then this cluster gets automatically created. This star shows that this is our current context, like we are using the kube config of this. So since we have exported the kube config of this cluster, so we can use kubectl as well to fetch the nodes. So we can use kubectl get nodes. And we have this this one here. Like we have this like you can see this control plane etcd, and then this so we have these nodes. We can also fetch the pods that are running here. Since this is exported, to fetch the kube config from any of the cluster, we can just specify rancher cluster kf, and then we can specify the name of the cluster. Like here it was rancher test, and this will give us the kube config for a particular cluster, and then we can export it to the kube config file that is there, and we can use the kubectl commands to work on it. Like we can fetch the pod to create any network policies, and for any of the test purpose we can use this. So this was basic things about the rancher CLI command. There are other rancher CLI commands as well, and then we have used this to set up our test script for the rancher CI pipeline, and we have trigger phase, that is the test rancher E2E, and then we have for conformance and network policy, and the tests are running fine on the Jenkins node. So this was all about the demo. Any questions or any input?
Not any questions, but I'm curious to understand what are we planning to do with the CI. So basically, are we going to run the same testing pipelines that you have with Antrea for rancher integration? So will there be specific rancher certification tests or both?
Yeah, so we'll be running. So this is the CI pipeline is set up so that we can have this rancher plus Antrea integration. So like other tests that are running. So whenever a PR will be created, the rancher test will also be running. So as to check that whether any of the code changes that have been made, are they compatible with the rancher or not, or is there any issue with the new code changes? So this is similar to other CI pipeline that are working.
Okay, great. And this is just for my ignorance, but how does the rancher do rancher have a certification program, and how does it work? Did they just ask us to run a Kubernetes conformance tests, or do they have some specific program for CNI certification?
Like for CNI certification, any program that I'm not aware of, but like for this, if they want, like we can share the report on the community that the CNI is working well, so that they can provide as a plugin option there. Like currently we do not have Antrea as a plugin option there, and we need to apply it with the help of the YAML there. So like once we have a successful report that all the conformance network policies and the other tests are running fine, then we can share it with the rancher community so that they can provide Antrea also as a plugin there in the rancher UI.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks. Do we have any more questions? Waiting a few more seconds. And it seems that probably all for the rancher CI integration. So we are looking forward to see this deployed as soon as possible. Thanks a lot, Pulkit, for this presentation. And now we move to open discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks. So is there any other topic that you would like to bring up for discussion? Any other concerning issue, anything, any idea?
Hello, Salvador.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have prepared a presentation about anti-proxy enhancements plan, and but I'm not sure if we have enough time to to make this presentation, because there is a I'm afraid we don't have much time now. Maybe next time, or I just make a quick presentation.
If it's a quick presentation, we have 15 minutes left in today's meeting, so we can surely go ahead. It depends on your estimate of how long it takes. If it's something between 10 and 20 minutes, yes, please go ahead. We can surely make it.
Okay, then I think I can make it quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
For desktop too. Okay, could you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I just start it. This is the entry proxy enhancement plan, and for the spot for the feature we spotted, and that's the endpoint slash topology aware hint proxy on. And the feature we are developing now endpoint slash data and the proxy terminating endpoints. I will introduce them in detail in later slides. And what we are going to do includes OpenFlow 1.5 operations like insert bucket and remove bucket. And another I have talked about it in earlier community meeting, more fine-grained puzzle update of Antrea proxy. And another is to pass more signet tests we need to do. We are going to do for endpoint slice in Antrea proxy. By default, it is disabled in Antrea proxy. When we switch it to enabled, it will listen to endpoint slash API in Kubernetes. By enabling this feature, endpoint slash Antrea, more features like topology aware hints or proxy terminating endpoints can be used in Antrea proxy. This can reach the functionalities of Antrea proxy. For topology aware hints in Antrea proxy, it has been supported. The motivation of this feature is that for two purposes. First, for cost saving by keeping service traffic within a logic zone. Generally, the zone is defined by labeling Kubernetes nodes with topology.kubernetes.io/zone equal zone name. Another purpose is for potential better performance. Generally speaking, within a zone, there will be less latency and bandwidth constraints. And there is some requirement for this feature. First, endpoint slash API is enabled in Kubernetes, and endpoint slash feature is enabled in Antrea. And by enabling this feature, with this feature disabled, we can see that a client in zone A can connect it to any endpoint in zone A or zone B. But when we enable this feature, the client in zone A can only connect to the endpoints in zone A. So that's to a client in zone B. That's a simple example. And the next feature is proxy terminating endpoints Antrea proxy. And we are developing that. But this feature is used to reduce potential traffic loss that occurs on rolling updates for load balancer. In simple, this feature, without this feature, only ready endpoints will be selected. We can see that when a service have ready and terminating endpoints, we only select ready endpoints, and without any endpoints, and the service will not have backend endpoints. But when we enable this this picture, we can see that when a service has ready backend endpoints, it is on it still we can see that still ready endpoints will be selected, but for the service that without ready endpoints, only terminate and then terminating endpoints will be used. Another thing we will do in Antrea proxy is to graduate endpoint slice to beta in Antrea proxy. We since we have support topology aware hints and we are and the proxy terminating endpoints. These two features makes use of the unique attributes of endpoint slice, like a topology aware hint. It uses the join and hint attribute of endpoint slice. As for proxy terminating endpoints, it uses conditions field attribute of endpoint slice. There are three keyword there are three state of conditions in endpoint slice, like ready, serving, and terminating. And there is something we are going to do in the future, like make use of OpenFlow bundled file, insert bucket or remove bucket operations. This is also used to reduce potential traffic loss when updating endpoints of service in Antrea proxy. Currently, when updating a service endpoints, we will generate a new OS group to override the existing one. By introducing the insert bucket and remove bucket, we can update the existing OS group. But one thing we need to verify that whether the delta updating of an OS group is better than overwriting the existing OS group. Another thing is to do. Another is more fine-grained parcel update of service. In current proxy code, we only update load balance flows and routes for ingress IPs parcially. For other attributes of service, all corresponding flows, routes, and IP sets will be uninstalled and reinstalled. For this item, I thought of there are the disadvantages of these plans are first, updating some attributes of a service may be corner case. Another disadvantage is that we will introduce more if-else branches in Antrea proxy code. And the potential advantage of this might be reduce potential traffic loss that occurs on updating a service. The last thing we are going to do is pass more signal test. In the coming release of Antrea, there are PRs to resolve this test. These tests are not. These tests we can't pass for Antrea with proxy out enabled and other options under default with other options. We also remove the cookie proxy, and this is IPv4 only. IPv4 only cluster. And we are going to pass. We are going to pass this part in the coming release. For other tests, I think we will handle them in the future. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Any question?
I have a question.
Okay.
When I was having presentation in China for Antrea, I received some questions about whether Antrea proxy could support features that IPVS could support, like a different backend selection algorithm. Do you think it would be possible to support that with Antrea proxy?
Oh, I remember that. Do you mean that we support some algorithm like RR or round robin or like other select algorithm? Is that?
Yeah. I'm not sure whether this is OS could do.
As far as I know, we can do that since I don't find any document in OS group to have such options or configurations. I think sorry. We know.
I just
please go
want
ahead.
to comment one thing. In fact, for OS, it does support, I remember 2 or 3 methods for the bucket selection. I think it could be used for the configurations.
You mean like a round robin?
Yes, like a round robin, and another one I remember is hash map, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. It seems that we don't have any questions. Oh, thanks, Salvador.
No problem. Thanks for your presentation. And we just have a couple of minutes left in the meeting. So if anybody wants to bring something else very quickly, well, we have 1 minute left in the meeting now. All right, so thanks thanks to everyday presenters, in particular, thanks to Hong Liang for keeping his presentation fairly short so that we could fit it in the scheduled meeting time. It's been great to know more about the new plans for the UI, the ranch integration and improvements for Antrea proxy. And I would like to thank everyone for attending this meeting. And according to your time zone, wishing you a good night, a good day, or a good afternoon. Thanks for joining, and see you again in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good one. Bye.